All right, welcome back to a new episode and a new year. We're in 2025 now, Pod, and we have a great guest to kick off this new year. We're the Sport Management Office Hours podcast. I'm Nick Zoroya, along with Brandon Podgorski, and this week we welcome in Dr. Julie Lanzillo from Neumann University. Julie, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you.
And it's funny enough, Julie kind of popped under our radar as a guest because she gave us a great shout out on LinkedIn and helped us grow our audience. And it was great to hear, just recently off air, how she stumbled upon the podcast and kind of turned it into a listening experience on the road while traveling. And we just want to say publicly, thank you so much for your support. This is just a kind of a random passion project that we've launched, and it's nice to know that somebody got some value out of it. So thank you very much.
My pleasure. And thank you for doing it. And I'm glad I found it, and it got me through a couple of hours of holiday travel.
Well, that's great. So you've been at Neumann now for close to 21 years, right?
So I started there in 2014. What year is it now? Full time. But in 2004, I started adjuncting there. So yes, in totality, 21 years, but full time, I'm in my 11th year.
Okay, and so you've been going at this a little bit longer than both of us. That's for sure. And so I'm interested to hear about all of your experience. And one thing that we all three have in common, and something that I think is very typical of sport management professors, especially at SLACs, is that almost all of us come from industry. And a lot of us are EDDs. So I'm very curious to hear about your journey from working in industry and then transitioning to education.
Yeah, thank
So
you.
yeah, if you want to outline how that journey kind of happened in your own words, that'd be great.
Sure. So as you mentioned, I worked in industry. I started actually when I was about 16, promoting baseball card shows when I was a teenager. So I always had a bit of an entrepreneurial streak, and went to college at North Carolina, not really sure what I wanted to do, and was going to be a CPA. And then I failed my first two accounting exams, and so that was the end of that. I changed my major about 8 times in college. I just couldn't land on anything, and it was around junior year that I figured out I could work in sports. And it was always like kind of right there, but you don't see some things that are often right there. So at that point in time, it was just get a degree in something. But I knew back in 1990 that I just needed experience. And so in the old days, I started picking up the phone and I started mailing out letters, because that's what you did in 1990. And there was no internet and email and all, and LinkedIn, of course. And so I just was looking for any place to get experience. And so that's really how things started for me. And so I worked in industry. I finished up my degree, and I got my first job at Baseball America magazine, and everything just snowballed from there. And so what happened was, around 2000 or 1999, maybe even, I had moved to the Philadelphia area. And of course, the internet was now a thing, and I had launched my own sports marketing company. I was working in the basketball space and doing some publishing, and then moving into player marketing, not an agent, but assisting with player marketing. And I got a random email from a student in Temple University and said, "Hey, would you want to speak at our career fair for sport management?" And I thought, that's a thing. That's crazy, right? So people go to school now to do what I have been doing for a long time. So I went, and that's kind of when I got a little hooked. It was really a fun day experience, getting the chance to go talk about what I do all the time, and my career path, and being an entrepreneur and starting my own business at that point. And so then I started to explore, like, what would it take to do this? At some point in the future, if I wanted to be a teacher in this particular area that I know, at that time, some stuff about. And so at that point, I only had my bachelor's degree, so I actually started looking around. And at that time in the Philadelphia market, there were only two programs that had a master's level in sport management, and they were Temple University and Neumann University. Ironically, had just launched their program like a year earlier. So I ended up going to Temple, and I ended up going there, making it very clear what my intentions were. I was 30 years old. I was the oldest person in my class. And I told the faculty there, I'm here because I want to eventually teach. Right? I already own my own business. I've worked in sports for years. I do not need this degree for anything other than academic credentials. And so they gave me a chance to teach right out of the gate. So I was a grad student. I was teaching an undergraduate class of sport marketing, and that solidified it for me. It was one of those crazy things where felt completely unprepared. Um, and I remember that class. In fact, this was in 2002, and I still talk to some of those students I had in that very first class. But in that time, as crazy as it was, and not really knowing what I was doing in terms of running a classroom, I loved it. And I didn't think I'd ever really worked as hard before on anything as I worked on that. And yet I had such a love for it. So that's how I knew. And so I kept going. I finished my master's. I went and got my EDD. And, being of a certain age, I wasn't really interested in moving anywhere in the country. So I just kind of had to be patient and see what was going to happen. And in 2014, it was, Newman called and said, "Hey, we have an opening and would you like it?" And so that's, as they say, the rest is sort of history.
I mean, that is so relatable because I think that's how almost all of us get started, especially at these smaller, you know. Sure, there's people now that they go into these larger programs at these big state schools with the intent of doing research in this field, and they get PhDs in sport management or something related, and they never actually touch industry unless they're consulting in some way. But for the rest of us at these smaller schools, this is exactly how I think everybody's journey starts. They go, they do a couple different jobs in the industry, kind of figure out what they want to do, and then they end up adjuncting somehow, whether it be
Mhm.
through guest speaking or whatever. And I was a Pod can tell you his story. I was basically a coach, a college coach, occasionally a teacher when in between coaching jobs, and until I was about 30. And I started my doctorate because I was adjuncting while being a full time college coach. And
Mhm.
that's when I realized, hey, this is what I actually want to do. I've always like teaching and coaching are so related. I've
Mhm.
always liked this, but I think I could do this forever. And not until 30 did I get my first full time teaching job, professor job. And just like you, I have a life here, I have a family here. I'm not leaving Southeastern Michigan. So it's just about waiting. And I told people, a lot of my students were like, well, why didn't you start this earlier? I was like, well, I'm in Southeastern Michigan. There's only a handful of jobs in the state that require a doctorate in sport management or anything related. You just have to wait your turn if you're not willing to move. And that's the same lesson we teach them too. If you want a job quickly, move wherever you have to move. But if you're going to be picky, you're going to have to wait, possibly wait a while. So I found that incredibly relatable because I think that's how, I mean, all of my adjuncts right now are all currently working in industry. And a
Mhm.
lot of them are thinking maybe this is something I want to do more permanently. And I
Mhm.
think that's just such a typical path and a good path because we are practitioners. We are training people with projects and internships and hands on experience. We're not training people to do research. We're training people for the real world. So I think that's all so relatable to me. Apod, you have a similar kind of background, and you're working on the EDD right now.
Yeah, so almost exact same background as you, Nick. I took a job. I was an entrepreneur, but I wanted to coach, and so I was taking a coaching job part time, and then eventually I got a full time coaching job, and with that I had to teach. And I realized, wow, I get the same feeling in the classroom that I do on the court, but I don't have to recruit, I don't have to scout, I don't have to do grade checks, I don't have to do all those other things that go along with coaching. So I'm like, man, this teaching gig's a pretty good deal, and that's I know now that that's where I want to go, and going and getting my PhD and finishing that off this year because I know I'm not going to go anywhere else in higher ed. But something else you said with our adjuncts, how great is it for our programs too? And I always think sport management is a little bit unique in higher ed, but for us to market our programs when we're able to get adjuncts who are actually in the field, because it just jumps off the page. Even if I'm not denigrating anybody, but even if you got like an inside ticket sales account rep for, I don't know a team that's struggling, the New York Jets. They're on the bottom of the totem pole in that organization, but all of a sudden, if they're adjuncting in your program, oh my gosh, somebody who works for the Jet. I mean, it just kind of jumps off the page. And Dr. Lanzillo, I am interested in hearing from you when you got started in teaching. So you were on the sports marketing side, you were actually doing it practically and making money, running your own business. I'm kind of interested. What do you think we get right in higher ed when we're teaching some of these things in sport management and marketing? And what are the things that maybe we need to change, or maybe like, yeah, in theory that sounded good, but when the rubber meets the road, it may not necessarily be that right.
Well, that's a loaded question.
Yeah.
I think part of what resonated with me when I first stumbled on your podcast is that you all come from working in the sports industry prior to moving into higher ed. That's a hill that I kind of die on when it comes to running my program, both my grad and my undergrad program, is that my faculty, colleagues, and adjuncts have to have industry experience. And it's again, not to be disrespectful to folks who've gone straight through to get their PhD, never worked a day in sports. That's their journey and that's their choice, and that's great. And my philosophy is that in order to teach sports, you have to have worked in sports. And that's just my philosophy. And it's not everyone's, and certainly other programs do things differently, and that's awesome. But one of the primary pillars is that you need to come from industry. The other thing too is you have to stay current in industry. In other words, I still consult. I'm on the board of directors of the Philadelphia Union Foundation. I'm on the board of directors of the Pennsylvania State Athletic Directors Association, and I still do work in the sports marketing space. So I think that it's one thing to have worked in sports, but if you haven't worked in sports since 2002 and you don't maintain relationships with people that work in the industry, and you don't stay current in what's happening in the industry, then that's the problem, is that you cannot tell war stories from 15 years ago and still be relevant. Because of course I make, references to cultural things that were funny when I was 25, and my students look at me like, yeah, we don't know what you're talking about. So I have to check myself on that. But I think that's where a lot of people do fall short, is they move into higher ed and they forget that that industry that we were in, that we know is dynamic, is still dynamic. And we're not aware of what's going on in it anymore. And so we lose our credibility, I think, because we're using material from 2012 that's maybe still interesting and factually correct, but not current. So I think that's the big one that I see, is that just because you worked in sports doesn't mean you're still qualified to be a great coach. And I use that word like you do, Nick. Coach and teacher, I think, have an awful lot of parallels. And so I think in order to stay that way, you need to still have a foot in the industry that we're trying to prepare these students to also enter.
Yeah,
Absolutely.
I think there's a huge difference between, and I think there's a time and a place for both, right? But sport management is this catch-all term where we are, half of us are preparing people for industry, and the other half are maybe preparing people for research or something like that. And here's the thing, um, my goal every day is to get people prepared for the workforce, and that's also sport management. But I think sport management oftentimes is, there's a large group of people working on sport theory. Like when you look at the journals, you look at what these people that don't have industry experience are actually researching. It's valuable stuff in sociology and in coaching and sports psychology and all of these things, and that's still very useful and very good. But the students, let's be honest, there's very few students that actually benefit from those things, because very few students say, I want to research sports for the rest of my life. So there is this disconnect between our industry, between the people that are strictly theory and then the people that are more practical. And I think that's, at a Slack, the idea is that we are all more hands-on and a little bit more practical, because our students are there to work in sports, not to study sports per se. And so I've, again, we all relate in that regard, that that's kind of our goal, is to prepare people. The staying relevant part was, I lucked out that I had a part-time job that I maintained while I started my full-time, you know, job as a professor in sports media, and I was able to hold on to that and keep doing that. And I can see how it'd be so easy for someone that moves from industry to academia to just turn that off and put all the focus into the new endeavor. And then you quickly realize it's really hard to get back in.
Mhm.
And so Pod has recently picked up a gig where he's working stats with the Pacers. And
Mhm.
you've always had your hands in a few pods with the ticket sales. You know, I still do sports media, and now possibly dabbling into stats, hopefully soon here, and doing the podcasting, all of these different things, social media marketing. And it's all very useful because the students do find that relatable. When they say, when you're doing sports marketing, for example, and I say, well, listen, you don't want to do your ad campaigns like this, or you don't want to do it like this. And they kind of wonder, how do you know that? And you're like, well, because I've managed an account with 100,000 followers. Like, I know that's recent. But like, with the way the technology is changing, I mean, I could be in 2 years, I could be referencing TikTok, and the students would start to be like, well, what's TikTok? Because it's
Mhm.
supposedly gone. So,
Right.
you know, I still use Twitter. I don't say X. And luckily my students could put two and two together. But I can't even make certain references. I'm 35. I can't make references about The Office sometimes because I'm down to like maybe two people that can relate to The Office. It's like, I never thought that would be an issue when I'm trying to draw some parallels, because it was so big. But yeah, it's incredibly important. And I think board work is one way that we all kind of leverage our credentials with our experience to stay relevant. But what are some other recommendations, I guess, that you would give to somebody transitioning into academia from industry to kind of keep those connections alive? It helps with, you know, staying relevant. It helps with marketing your program. It helps with networking for guest speakers and for students and for internships. So we all know the importance of it, but I guess, what kind of advice would you give someone to kind of keep those connections alive and not just become solely a professor at that point?
Yeah, so, one of the pillars of my program is that I hammer on students that they have to build professional relationships from day one. In fact, I don't even use the term networking anymore because to me that sounds too transactional, and that's not really what I think they should be doing. They should be building professional relationships. My whole career is based upon that. I've never applied for a job in my entire career. And when I tell them that, it catches some attention in the room, especially with the freshmen. And they're like, well, how is that possible? How have you, done consulting work for the NFL or started your own business or worked with MLS or NASCAR? How did you do that and not apply for those jobs? And I said, it's because of my skill set and people who knew me. And those are the two sort of magical elements that you have to have. It's not just who knows you, because if you can't then do the work, you're not gonna maintain the ability to stay in that position. So, I still do what I tell my students to do. So, we teach students here day 1, informational interviews. And, you know, not only do we say you have to do them, but we certainly try to coach them through what's the most effective way to do that. Not to hit up somebody on LinkedIn and say, "Hey, I have an assignment, and would you answer these 5 questions?" Because I still get those. I get emails from students around the world because of my LinkedIn and my background that say, "Hey, I want to work in soccer. Um, I've got an assignment due next Thursday. Could you answer these questions?" And I delete that message because that's not what you do. Or I'll screenshot it, take out the name, and then I'll show it to my students and say, "Don't do that." So the point there is that I do what I tell them to do. I still do informational interviews. I still reach out to folks and want to learn and understand, because just because I teach sport management and sport business and run a program doesn't mean I'm an expert. This is a dynamic industry, as we said, and there's always new things happening. And I'm always reading articles and then reaching out to people who wrote it, who may have been mentioned in that article, and tell them who I am and say, I'd love the chance to connect with you and talk and ask some more questions about XYZ. So I think that's something that I have maintained. And, the reasons for doing it are different maybe than they were 15 years ago, but the premise is still the same. And so I think if I'm going to tell my students that they need to be doing this, I need to be doing it because I also want them to understand that this is a lifelong thing they should be doing, that you just shouldn't be reaching out to people while you're a student, that once you get that first career opportunity, you still want to be building relationships because you don't know what's going to come next. Do you want to stay a ticket rep for the next 40 years, or do you want to be a coordinator at a college um, athletic department for 25 years? No, you want to continue to build your career. And so, as we all know, relationships are an essential part of that in the industry that we're in. And so I continue to do that. And I think that's where, again, I think a lot of faculty that I see and meet around the country do a good job of that. And I think a lot of them don't. And again, I don't know what their rationale is for why or why not, but I think it's essential. It's again, it's about, do you stay relevant? How do you continue to do a good job for the students that are in your care, essentially? And I think that you have to continually improve yourself in order to be able to benefit them.
Yeah,
When you were
yeah,
going through
go
all
ahead.
that, yeah, Nick, if you don't mind,
Yeah,
something that kind of came to my mind in this industry, and I'm sure it's true for a lot of industries, but in this one is just having a genuine curiosity about things going on, because you're right, this industry moves so fast and changes come so quick. But I think for a lot of us that are in it, especially those who are practitioners and now who are actually in higher ed, I mean, we love this. I tell my students all the time, I'm one of the dumbest people you're going to meet in higher ed, but I know sport. It's like the only thing that I'm good at, and I love this thing. And if you're going to be working, 80-hour weeks and nights and weekends and holidays and all the grind that goes along with it, like you gotta love it. So I'm interested to hear from both of you, because I think this is a struggle that I would have with students, especially at a smaller school that was real. A lot of our enrollment was driven by athletics, and you guys understand what I mean by that. We got students coming in, they're coming into sport management. Oh, I like sports. It sounds like a cool program. So you've got 100 students in there, but you really only got maybe 10% who are engaged, who want to make this a career, and they're going to do everything they can to get there. And then you've got about 90% who, I play a sport. The sport management kind of sounds cool. Right? And I'm generalizing. I understand that. But what can we do for those students who, again, in that 90%, they're not going to go play pro ball? What can we do to develop that love and that genuine curiosity, and before they hit April of senior year and realize, oh shoot, I got a month to graduate, I haven't done anything? Like, any great strategies I'm open to.
well, I'll start because we have some, and I feel, I don't want to say your pain, but it is a pain point for sure, because we go in and we put everything we have into our students, right? And we hope that it lands, and it's really hard to tell sometimes. And yeah, 90% of my student base, I have 75 majors on my campus, and 90% of them are athletes. All of them are athletes or former athletes. I've also adjuncted in R2 where it's 10% are athletes and 90% are former athletes. And the difference is stark because, when these students are current athletes, they always kick that can down the road of, well, I'll get my internship next semester or next semester. And that's the worst thing we can do. So the one strategy that has bore some fruit is that part of their freshman year intro to sport management course, we dedicate an entire unit to careers in sports. And we lay out a 4-year plan of, okay, it would be great if you had 4 internships when you left here. But if you can't pull that off, first year, here's what you should be doing. You should be reaching out, doing informational interviews, trying to figure out, because they all say when they want to work in sports, and I was the exact same way. I want to work in sports. I don't know if I want to be an AD. I don't know if I want to do ticket sales. I had no clue. I just know I want to be around sports. So doing informational interviews, I actually recorded a video of my first year where I interviewed 10 people in the industry for an hour. And I just kept that and I gave it to the students as part of that week's lesson and said, listen to all of them, figure out are any of these careers that you might want to do, and then follow up with more people. So we do that part. And the 4-year plan says, if you can't intern, volunteer. And that's like one of the best ways that you can get experience and start to figure out what you want to do. But we do lay out this 4-year plan, and again, it falls on deaf ears sometimes. But I did have one student that listened to me and went on work in sports as a freshman. And that summer, he did that in December. And that summer, he was working in South Dakota for one of those summer baseball leagues. And sophomore year, then he came in and had a local internship working for a semi-pro for an OHL hockey team, driving an hour and a half every weekend to go work an OHL hockey team. And then the next summer went back to the baseball team, but now as a paid intern doing all the broadcasting and all the social media. And then like it's scaffolded, right? Like it builds on itself, and that's what this is. But if you start senior year, you're so far behind the 8 ball. And so the only thing, I mean, this is life, right? We always tell people, if you could learn from me and avoid my mistakes, and they either listen or they don't. But the people that listen, and if you get that info to them their freshman year, it has a higher chance of working. We just try to hit it really hard freshman year of like, this is the plan. This is how you find success. It's not a straight road. There's going to be a lot of bends and breaks, but half of this battle is figuring out what you don't want to do. Like, I had a student intern in the athletic department, which happens so often, as we know, because it's convenient. And if they wait too long, that's where you're going to go. And he figured out, yeah, I don't like event management. I don't like sitting out in the cold. I don't like shagging balls. I was like, great. Well, if nothing else, we figured out what you don't want to do. And that's half the battle. You don't want to be figuring out what you don't want to do from years 25 to 30, like some of us have. So it's just about getting started super early, Pod, and just giving them the information. And again, though, it's up to them what they do with it. And the ones that are really motivated, they're the ones that are going to take it and run. And the rest of them, I mean, I only have one meeting a week where somebody comes in for office hours. But every time he leaves the meeting saying, this has been so helpful. This is what I needed. I was like, you've paid for this. Like this help with your career, and this help with like, hey, your spring football season ends in March. Like, what if we have you go to a high school and work with an AD for 3 months afterward? Would that work for you? He goes, I didn't know I could do that. Yeah, you can totally do that. Let me make a phone call. I feel so much better leaving this meeting about like where I might go with my career. Great. And I told them, if everything blows up and you want to pivot next year, we'll pivot. Like, let's figure it out. But to have only one person showing up to do that meeting when anybody can show up whenever, that's what's heartbreaking. And then they're surprised when they don't get the internship with the Pistons against 1,000 other students that have applied, and their resume says nothing. So sometimes it's that volunteer work that you did that turns into a shadow. Like I have another student that shadows, doesn't have time for internships, has to pay her way through school, shadows constantly. That's building up her, it's not networking in the traditional sense, but that's building up her network. That's opening doors, having conversations with people. And to me, yes, we do require a 2-credit internship, but that's so much more valuable doing that over and over and over again than just one person, one internship. So uh, hopefully those are ideas for you, Pod. That's not a solution. That's just one method. And I'm sure Dr. Lanzillo has a couple more. So I'll pass the torch over to you.
Thanks, Nick. Yeah, I love all of what you said. I think that the only thing I can perhaps add to that is a couple of things. And one is I'm a little blunt, and some students who've told me I'm a little intimidating or whatever other word you want to use, which I find kind of funny. I'm 55, I'm 5'3". I mean, I don't think I'm that intimidating, but um I'm blunt, and I think that sometimes is a little scary. So I'll oftentimes come in and I don't teach the freshmen because of other responsibilities. So I try to go in and meet the freshmen early on in the fall and then in the spring when they take intro. I think the other thing that's really important is if you're a sport management student coming in, you're in sport management classes immediately. You know, I see some other schools that you don't start till sophomore or God forbid junior year in your major, and that's just mind blowing to me. So that's one. Um, because they may not like it, right? Sport management is a sexy major, is what I always say, and you're not going to be sitting courtside at the Lakers games or drinking Cristal with LeBron in the limo. Like some kids are think that's what it is. So, you know, we lose kids right away, and that's great because they realize that this isn't what it is and it's not what's going to make them happy, and that's not good for anybody. So, some students come in, they leave the major right away. Once they get a dose of the fact that this is now work and you have to kind of check, well, you don't kind of, you have to check your fandom at the door is a phrase that I regularly use. And then with the freshmen, oftentimes I'll walk in, they don't know who I am, although they should. And I'll say, who wants to work in sports? And every hand goes up. And then I'll say, okay, who's determined to work in sports? And you know, some hands go down. And I tell them, you should go change your major. And I'm not trying to be sarcastic or mean, but if you're not determined to do this, you're not going to do it. Because everyone else whose hand is raised that's determined to do it, if they're being honest with themselves, they're going to beat you. It's a very competitive industry, as we all know, to get into, but to me, the difference is determination. If you are determined to do it, you will. Because if I could do it when I was 20, anybody can. But you have to have that determination factor. And the other thing too is that when you start to have students that are freshmen, and this the last couple of years of my freshman class has really been stellar. I've got freshmen who are interning in the fall. Like they get an internship or an opportunity like 3 weeks into the semester. It's phenomenal. And not at the athletic department. So I think that becomes a really interesting component to the motivation factor, because when you're sitting in classroom and you're realizing, wait a minute, this person's doing that, and that person is doing this, and I'm not, right? Hopefully something's going to start to click there, and you're going to realize you're maybe falling behind a little bit, right? We can always catch up, but oftentimes it's the other people, the other students in the program who are at the same level that are doing things that causes people to go, uh-oh, I'm behind. And then again, that's the deciding factor. Are you determined or are you not? And I have no problem telling people when they come into my office, my senior year maybe, and there's a panic, and there's always one, you know, there's always a handful of those every year. And the first thing I'll say to them is, so those informational interviews you did as a freshman, what have you done to maintain relationships with those people? And again, I'm not trying to be horrible and unhelpful, but you've been hearing this message for 3 years. And the initial message always is, you have to drive your own bus. We'll be here in the background to coach you, to support you, but you have to want this. I've already had my career, right? This is now your decision about where you want to go. And so when the answer is, well, I haven't, you know, I can't go back 3 years and fix the things that you didn't do. And I hate to be blunt about it, but it's just the reality. So oftentimes sharing those stories with freshmen, you know, and quite honestly, some of my seniors will come in or juniors will come in and talk to the freshmen and be honest about their own shortcomings and say, you know what, I should have done that. So don't do what I didn't do, right? Go out and do the things that I'm here to tell you. If I could go back 2 years, I would have done differently. And that's impactful, I think, and really powerful, right? Because as you said, after a while, you know, we don't resonate with students. And so when you have someone who's a year or 2.5, 3 years older than them, who's a lot more relatable in terms of that, being blunt and truthful and honest about things they wish they had maybe done differently, but at the same time, some of their successes as well. That's impactful. So I think getting students to hear the message different ways from different audiences and different people, but with the same general underlying message of you need to do these things is a powerful way that I've seen have an impact. And again, you know, relationship building starts in the classroom. And so I think for myself, and there's a very fine line here, is how much we're willing to humanize ourselves with students so that they do feel comfortable coming to us and talking to us in a candid sort of way about maybe I don't know what to do, or I feel like I'm not sure if I don't know. But it's a lot of what I have found in my 20 plus years of doing this from adjunct to full time is that sometimes students just there's a barrier there, and I think that it's incumbent on us at times to try to build a relationship that is appropriate, right? And but when we allow ourselves to be a little vulnerable and we show our own humanity, I think that helps create a sense of trust that then, allows us to have these kind of candid conversations where we don't have one person dropping by for office hours, but we have 10. Or, we go out and we do things together. Like I try to run a lot of trips, whether it's local or, taking some students to Atlanta in a couple days for the National Collegiate Sports Sales Championship. Spending time together outside of the classroom is a commitment on our part as faculty. But again, those moments help build trust that help allow us to have those conversations that are going to only benefit them, and that takes time. That doesn't happen overnight. And so again, I think it's looking at it as a long game. um but there's a lot of different ways that you can do that. I mean, I tried. I just was named the FAR on my campus, and so I, going to games and having students see you in the soccer stadium or in the basketball arena, ironically or not, it matters. It's really fantastic when I get a message that night late, "Hey, I saw you there, and I starting to get to see you, but or talk to you." But I think all of that stuff adds up, which again allows us to have relationships with students because that's really where the coaching or the learning happens is when there's a degree of relationship and trust that's mutual, that then some really amazing things can get accomplished. But I've had students, and this is crazy, 4 years all through undergrad, never spoke to me, come into class kind of like this, never talked to me. And I'm not trying to say that I'm the reason, but they don't have a job in sports. And because that's one symptom of what they just couldn't pull the trigger on. If they can't talk to me, then they're certainly not talking to anybody else, right? And we know how critically
Yeah.
important that is. So it's just interesting. Some students, for whatever reason, they aren't going to listen to me, to the dozens of guest speakers that come in every year, the adjuncts that work in sports. They're just not going to listen. And I can't control that.
Yeah, absolutely. And I find it laughable too because there'll be seniors that all of a sudden I realize they don't know. I mean, I tell people all through, I teach every level of our program to different degrees. And they know what I do and what I've done. And the only reason I'm not ever doing it to brag, it's doing it to say, like, if you're interested in something like this, I've done this, or I know these people. I did another podcast recently with, and the co-host was somebody that did sideline reporting for ESPN. And then it took 3 years for people to be like, well, I kind of want to work. I think I might want to get into broadcasting or journalism or something. Well, okay. Well, if you had told me that a while ago, or if, at any point, I could have helped you out, and I could be on the phone with people. Like I once recorded a podcast with 5 on-air personalities from ESPN. You don't think I could have connected you? And they don't always take the time to put two and two together or to ask the right questions. And I'm definitely a professor that puts myself completely out there. Like, if you want to know anything, just ask. Like, I don't care. Like, I remember, I always joke, I'm still young enough to know like what it's like to be in your shoes for a little bit longer. So, like, just ask the questions, and the people that ask the questions, those are the ones that like, all right, they've got a chance. And to speak about the bluntness, it's hard to both be the fun, accessible professor and also be the blunt professor, but it's a line we walk, right? And in that freshman class, I do tell people, if you don't want to work nights, if you're not prepared to start your first job in sports at less than 40K, you're in the wrong major. That's just the way it is. That's not to discourage you, but that's just the real life. And if you think you're going to be an agent, again, we can talk about that. I'm not saying it's impossible, but we need a plan today. And I need to know, like, it's going to be difficult. It's going to be difficult. So let's have a talk offline about that career choice.
Well, I
But
worked
then
in
we also run
basketball
into
space
people
for
that
a
just
long time. And I'm sorry, go ahead, Nick.
no, I was just gonna say we also run into people that like they just say, I just want to be a coach.
Sure, that's right. That's great.
And that's great. And I don't think sport management is the wrong program for you. I think you might benefit more from going over to PE and exercise science. And if you want to do a sport management minor, I will support that.
Mhm.
But for you to sit through this program and learn about all these different aspects of sports and only take one coaching course might not be the best long term. I do know you're probably going to go GA and then probably going to go, and that's fine. Like I've been on that journey, and that's why I'm telling you there are shortcuts if you want to do that. And if you think you want to be a high school football coach and this is the major that you're choosing, again, not necessarily the wrong major, but maybe not the best major, because guess
Mhm.
what? You need a day job.
Right.
At least because we're not in Texas, so you're not getting a full-time paycheck just to coach football.
Right.
So again, you might need a certification. So, but that's something we're there to do too, is explain that to people, because we know that they don't know that coming into it. They don't know that they need certain certificates, all of these things. But I digress. So you were going to add something there.
Yeah, so when I worked in the basketball space, I worked around a lot of agents and what I would say wannabe agents, and in the Philadelphia market, there's a lot of that, and it's been tampered down. But 20 years ago, was everyone was an agent or a trainer or whatever. And a couple of stories there, because again, to your point, some students come in and they say they want to be an agent, and all right, you know. And back when I started teaching, of course, Jerry Maguire was still a movie people knew about, and I swear, and I always would say, you know, that movie made my job very hard, because students were all like, "Oh, I want to be that." And I'll tell them, I'll say, "Okay, how much cash do you have on hand?" And they'll look at me funny, and I'll say, "Okay, so about 20 years ago, I was working in basketball, and I was at Austin P State in Kentucky. And there was a guy named Bubba Wells at the time who had 2 rods in his legs, who was like, you know, one of the greatest players ever at Austin P. And you know, he was 6'6", 6'7", good player for that level, right? Low level D1, and being talked about as a potential draft pick. And so agents were coming out of the woodwork to this guy's game to try and court the mom, the grandmom, right? All the stuff. And so and I'll say, "Well, how much cash?" They're like, "What do you mean, why much cash?" I said, "Well, I literally saw a guy hand his grandmother a suitcase with $40,000 in it. Like, I watched this happen in a parking lot outside of the gym." And they look at me. I'm like, "Yeah, and this is for a guy who's a bubble draft pick." I said, "I also saw another wannabe agent show up with a brand new Lexus and try to offer the keys to his father." And they're like, "What are you talking about?" And I'm like, "This is the reality of that industry." And I'll say to them, "Well, okay, you don't know anyone who's going to be a professional athlete at a high level," which is, of course, how Lee Steinberg got started, right? With Steve Bartkowski way back. You don't just become an agent. And I said, "You know how much money you can charge a second round NBA pick for your commission? Do you know what a collective bargaining agreement is?" No. "Well, then you're not going to be an agent," right? Like, that's the bluntness of it, because they're not, and we know they're not. And but if that motivates them, and this happened, I had a kid come into my office 2 weeks after I said that to a group of freshmen, and he had downloaded the NFL collective bargaining agreement, printed it out, was reading it and making notes. And I'm like, "Okay, all right, because now that's the, are you, do you want to work in sports, or are you determined?" This kid's not necessarily going to become an agent or a GM or work in player personnel, but he's got a hell of a lot better shot than anybody else that I've seen in that class, because he's doing the work. I mean, this is what he's doing in his free time, is reading the CBA, right? So the agent piece is part of that sexiness, I think, of our industry. They're not going into that. Or if they are determined to do it, yeah, they may get there. This one kid may get there. But that's where I say to everyone else in the room, well, this kid knows what the CBA is. Look, he's carrying it around, right? It's this thick. He's reading it. What are you doing? So oftentimes it's, not meant to shame, but it's to say, there's competition for every job.
Mhm.
What are you doing to elevate yourself? Because this person over here is doing this right now. They're putting in the investment in who they want to become because that's what it is. He's not wasting his time. He's got a dream and he's going after it. Some people have a dream and they don't execute on it. That's just a dream. This particular young man may or may not get to where he wants to go, but he's got a way better shot because he's investing in himself, doing the homework and talking to people. And now because he's reading the CBA, when he gets on an informational interview with somebody in the NFL and player personnel, they can have a real conversation. And, when we talk about professional branding and personal branding, this young man now is going to get someone's attention somewhere because he's doing this kind of stuff in his spare time, right? Which again, if you know the Howie Roseman story with the Eagles, right? How he became the president of the Eagles. Same kind of journey, right? It was just persistent, persistent, persistent. So I think that becomes the thing about the agency thing. And the other thing that I'll say about it when we're talking about programs in general, it really upsets me when colleges try to promote their program and they say, come be a sport management
Yeah.
student because you can be a GM, a sports agent, and that makes me really unhappy
Yes.
because you're selling a dream to students that we all generally know is not likely. Right? You come in
Yeah.
and say, if you don't want to work in sports on nights, weekends, and holidays, and start in the industry for about 40 grand a year, maybe even less, that's the reality. And so you're telling them the truth, and then you're letting them make their own decision. When you dangle this stuff out there, like you could be an agent or a GM, that really upsets me because we know that's not likely. Right? And so you're trying to attract students and sell them on something that's a bait and switch,
Yeah.
and
Possible,
that
just not very
disturbs
likely.
me when it comes to looking at programs in higher ed in general in our discipline. The programs that are blunt and honest, I have all the respect in the world for, but the ones that are out there trying to grab students with a false promise are very concerning to me.
Yeah. I mean, there's one in particular in a positive way that preaches athletic administration, and they have hundreds of high school athletic directors as their alumni. I think we all know who I'm talking about. And it's okay if that's sure. If you want to preach that and market that because it's the truth, absolutely.
Yeah.
We actually require all of our majors to have a certificate. Used to be a concentration, but it was just cleaner to do certificates. And I actually added a pre-law certificate. So if you tell me you want to be an agent, you have to take 3 pre-law classes in our paralegal studies program, along with our legal and ethical issues of sport class, which is taught by a JD and a deputy athletic director who is a compliance officer. So if by the end of that time you're serious, then I will write your recommendation to law school, and so will 3 other people. Because everybody thinks being an agent now, like you just do the marketing part, and there's truth to that. You can go work in just marketing. Again, not likely, but it's possible. But like the standard path of going and becoming a lawyer is, I guess, less talked about nowadays because now they just hire lawyers to do the contracts. But and I tell them too, like, if you want to be an agent or work in that space, like you should go work for one of the big, huge companies because an intern, because guess what, they're so segmented in what they do. You're either marketing or your relations or you're this or you're that, and you'll figure out quickly whether it's something that you can handle or not. There's very few people that successfully run boutique offices, and anybody with a law degree has a couple clients that they just review contracts for these days. So uh, it's unlikely, and again, it just speaks to your broader point of the bait and switch. Let's promote careers and market careers that we know are accessible, that are likely to happen. I I don't think we should pigeonhole ourselves and say, no, you can't do these things, but let's be realistic about it too. Like there will be a student here and there where you're like, yes, you could pull that off.
Sure.
You're gonna
No,
have to
I
work very
absolutely
hard.
don't would never
Yeah,
squash a dream, right?
right,
But I do
right.
think it's our job to prepare students, right? And to say, okay, never give this up. But what are your contingency plans, right? And to help coach them through what that is, because I think it's our job to prepare them. And right. And so, yeah, this is your dream. That's amazing. And if you're like this particular young man I was talking about before, and you're pursuing that, that's phenomenal. But he's also smart enough to know that he needs a contingency plan, because he's not going to be an agent or a salary cap expert in a year and a half making six figures. So he knows that's long term. He understands that there's going to be steps between now and then that he's going to have to take or follow. And so, um, it's all about sort of managing all of that, right? Encouraging and you know, trying to help discover the potential to accomplish what their dream is, but then helping them manage the expectations around that and the ability to effectively achieve that, hopefully. And if not, because you've had students where, yeah, I want to do this, and then within 6 months some new guest speaker comes in and they're like, oh my gosh, that sounds amazing, I want to do that now. I was that way. So we know that happens as well. And so it's giving them the ability to expand and to be flexible, and you're here for a few years. Use that time to going back to one of the first things you said, be curious. Just because you think you want to do this now, but you're 18 years old and you have no idea what this industry really offers you. You just know this, and that's great, and that may be what you end up doing. But most of the students that I know that come in as a freshman and say they want to do X, by the time they've left, they don't want to do X, and they've already done A, B, C, D, E, F, and that's the route that they're on. So, you know, always encourage and support the dream, but also try to give them a little bit of an anchor and say, you know, our job here is to prepare you for lots of eventualities, right? Let's pursue the dream, but let's make sure that you have other things that are going to take care of you.
Yeah.
And, if that doesn't happen, it's okay. But let's
That's my
take the time
favorite.
to,
It's my favorite uncomfortable conversation to have is
yeah.
I want you to achieve that goal, but let's pretend for a second that something goes wrong.
Okay.
So what are we going to do instead? What can we use as a piece of this path that you can still have a career, have a family if things don't go perfectly to plan? I
Yeah.
don't want you to put all your eggs into one basket. It doesn't work out, and now you're so specifically trained and all your education's in one field to the point where you can't do anything else,
Right.
and that's a disservice. So it's a good conversation to have, yet an uncomfortable one, because you are kind of telling them, hey, it's still a dream. Like this might not happen, and they don't want to hear that. But the smart ones, the practical ones, understand that you're not doing it to be mean. You're doing it because you owe it to them to be realistic. So, Pod, I know you've been itching to jump in here.
Well, I think it comes from a student-centered focus. And I think probably all of us, I'm student-centered. So what I want to do, it's going to be for your benefit. There's another side of that where you also have to kind of worry about the health of your program. And I think we're probably all in alignment on this, but like, I can't lie to you. And my ethics really mean something to me. So when I would have families sit down of high school seniors and say, okay, well, my son is interested in sport management and he wants to be a GM. What can you do to get him there? And again, I'm probably not as blunt with parents. I'm probably a little bit more, a little bit more softer, but still I'm like, well, there's only 32 of them in Major League Baseball. And we've got 400-degree programs, sport management degree programs in the country. So, you guys do the math on that. However, if he can become a GM, boy, there's a lot of other things that we can do in this program. And, to Dr. Lanzillo's point, I started wanting to be on ESPN and be a sports broadcaster. And then I realized, that might not be my dream. So, let me look here on the business side of sport. And I've had a lot of students who've gone through that who, I wanted to do this, but now I see kind of the business side. And, I never became GM of the Pistons, but now I'm manager of inside sales or managers of group sales, and I'm making $100,000 per year. And so I use that as my marketing piece. And I let students know as freshmen, and I let parents know coming in, I'm like, this is probably where they're going to end up in sport. The Jerry Maguires of the world, or, the Scott Borases of the world, if we're using a real world example, they're just rare. And a lot of them had networks. I mean, Brian Cashman had friends of the family of New York Yankees, which is how he got his job. I mean, it wasn't just some wonderkin. But the more that I can place in sport and the more who are having really nice careers and probably making more money than I am as a professor, that's awesome for my program, because now I can market it. Hey, we're going to get you a job in sport. And I think that jumps off the page. And, to go back to our first discussion of, research versus kind of more on the educational side, that research is important, and I use it and I need it, and those people are needed. But if you're not doing anything for your program to actually get students jobs, get them into the industry, get them experience, I mean, what are we doing? I just don't think it's in the best interest of your program overall.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. Couldn't agree more with that, because I think, especially in the climate of higher ed right now, which I think everyone's feeling nationwide, is what's people are questioning the value of higher ed. And I
Yep.
think that we have a responsibility, in our discipline, again, going back to why are the students choosing sport management? Because they want to work in sports more than likely. So I believe that it's our job to, through all of the things we've talked about, have realistic conversations, do the right thing to prepare them, not only in the classroom, but outside of the classroom. That's what I think the answer is. I have a saying when I have, open houses or talk to parents, and I tell them that my job is not to help your son or daughter graduate. And they kind of look at me funny, and I say, my job is to help them prepare for their career. And I said, there's a very big difference between those two things, because a diploma on the wall looks nice, but it doesn't get you a job. And so that's all of those other pieces that I think happen in certain programs that are focused on the student. You said student-centered before, and that's true. I mean, the student-centered experience is not just a couple hours a week in the classroom. It's what are we doing with each of these individuals who have different backgrounds and experiences and desires to help prepare them to work in an industry that is as diverse as any, right? You're going to work in sales, or do you want to work at the YMCA, right? Do you want to work in community-based recreation, or do you want to work in the NFL? That, it's all the same industry, but it's so vastly different. Do you want to be in sales? Do you want to be in operations? Do you want to be in nonprofit? There's all of these different things that, we have to try to expose students to, and we only have a small amount of time to do it. But, I thoroughly agree with that, is that our job is to help launch their career and prepare them to enter an industry, not to merely get them through classes and have them memorize a bunch of stuff in a textbook and spit it back on a test. That's not preparing them for anything.
I want to piggyback on that because I love that statement. And one that I give is that your degree won't help you get your job. It will help you do your job.
Yep.
So the information and all the experience and everything we do, that'll help you once you get into that job to do it. That piece of paper does not help you actually get the job. All the stuff that we talked about today is what helps you get the job. The informational interviews, the outreach, the networking, the guest speakers, the volunteering, all of those things are going to be what open the doors for you. The things we teach you in the classroom are going to help you then be successful once you have that job. But
It's
just
the minimum barrier for entry.
This
degree.
is not accounting where here's my credentials. Oh, great, you're qualified. Here's a position. It's not that cut and dry, but this is not. Sport management is such a broad term, and that's what people always forget in higher ed. Like most course subjects and most majors are much more specific. We cover so many different aspects of business and sociology and all of these things that it's unrealistic to think that this paper automatically gets you this job. It's not linear like that. And so I always tell them that too. It's like, yeah, just like you will not just graduate with this degree and then just go be like, here you go. There is no job that's just like, great. They want to see what you can do for them. They want to see what experiences you've had. And that's where all that other stuff comes. So it's the in-class stuff is on me and everything else is on you. And I had a very real conversation with a athlete that was asked, props to asking me questions before you're admitted and even committed about our program and how you can do XYZ career. But I was very realistic. Like, just because you come here, I'm not handing you an internship with the Pistons. That's not how this works.
No.
100%.
And also, like you said earlier, you're going to be driving the bus, and I'm just going to help give directions here and there and make sure that we're, you're going the right way, and kind of help you from making. Like I always told my dad, don't stop me if my mistake is going to like result in a very small learning thing. If I'm going to hurt myself, then please stop me. Okay, then jump in. Otherwise, let me make my own mistakes. Same thing for our students. If you want to try something, I'm not going to stop you unless it's going to be detrimental to you. I'm going to let you learn. But it's the same thing, right? Props to reaching out, but also I was very blunt and said, this is going to be driven by you. Here's my experience. Here's how I can help you. But that's it. Like, you're going to have to do the rest. There's no program in the country that says, if you come here you go. Here's a great internship. No, I mean, none of us are well staffed enough and funded well enough to be able to just buy our students internship experiences and stuff like that. It just doesn't exist. So I think that this has been such, I hope for every sport management professor out there, and even most students, an eye-opening and relatable conversation about what it is that we do and why it is that we do it. And I think specifically how this impacts students in their careers, because I think we've talked at length now about what it is that you can realistically expect in our programs. Mm-hmm. And I don't have a problem at all with what we've said, because it's the truth, and we stand by that. So I want to thank you so much, Dr. Lanzillo. I mean, we can go on and on and on, but we all have stuff to do. You have conferences to get to soon. Pod and I are off to Vegas at the end of the month for Cosma. So
I'll see you there.
Will you? Perfect. Yeah.
Oh, great.
That's awesome.
I'll be there
we can meet up. We should have recorded a live podcast, but maybe next time.
Okay.
Maybe next time. But well, then I look forward to seeing everyone in Vegas. And for those of you that aren't going, consider going to Cosma. It's one of the best bang for your bucks that you can get out there. So thank you very much, Dr. Lanzillo, and tune in next week or in 2 weeks for another episode.
Thank you both so much for reaching out and the opportunity. I appreciate it.